They arrived like a rumor you couldn't ignore, great pale shapes unfolding over the ocean, blacking out the stars, turning the city into a thumbnail under their shadow. The first transmissions were polite and bored, the second transmissions were curious. The third one was the one that laughed. They had a word for us that was almost polite. Soft. They studied our faces the way a chef studies fruit, for ripeness, for weakness. They came with claws folded into sleeves of metal and eyes that read temperature and hesitation and muscle tension down to the twitch of a child's eyelid. They called out our names in the language of trackers and taxonomists, catalogued our cities as if deciding whether to harvest or domesticate, and when we did not produce the kind of fear they wanted, they laughed the long, dry laugh of predators who have never missed their dinner. We were small on their screens. We were loud and messy and noisy. We made mistakes. We cried. We surrendered. We begged a lot. They videotaped our pleas and played them aboard their ships like a piano. Player practicing scales. The generals liked to place bets on how long a human species would last when it learned the grammar of defeat. Their bets were mathematical, clinical. After the first week, they had spreadsheets that described our pain curves, charts that predicted how long until a named city would stop fighting. It was efficient. It was elegant. It made them relaxed. They took our monuments as trophies and our governments as curiosities. They moved through our neighborhoods with the cool, arrogant certainty of specialists. They painted murals on our walls that were intended to be funny, caricatures of our faces, mouths pulled sideways, eyes too big. They made children stand in circles while they mimed our deaths and handed out candies that tasted like metal. On the central plaza of a capital, they set up a stage with a scaffold and a microphone. They made a show of mercy. A poet would be allowed to speak. A hero would kneel. There was always an audience of cameras. There were always bets being placed. They expected obedience. They expected the small, acute animal sounds of surrender. We did not give them those sounds. At the scaffold, there was a woman on her knees. Her name was Mara. If you must pin a name to the story, then pin that one. There were cameras, of course. Lenses painted the beads of rain on her hair and the tremor at the corner of her mouth. The alien in attendance had a throat like a bell and a smile that was the wrong kind of smile, long and thin the way a predator's grin is long, presenting teeth as if to sharpen them. "Make it quick," the alien said, and its voice was a hammered thing that could be translated into 2 words and a shrug. Mara looked up. She had the kind of face that had been in too many winter nights. She had seen the hungry shapes of rage that follow occupation. She had a scar that ran like a pale river from ear to jaw, and she had children who would not be taken by the lists. She stood like a thing someone forgot to break. Then Mara smiled. It was stupidly simple, not broad like a triumph, not apologetic, not the savage grin of someone trying to hide fear. It was something else, an almost private curve that there is in people who have decided to own a moment instead of being owned by it. The laughter in the alien crowd under the scaffold stuttered like a record with a chip. The cameras registered a spike in microvolt patterns that their analysts had never classified. On board the mothership, someone stopped their typing. A human smiled. An animal on the verge of oblivion smiled with its teeth exposed. It was useless and graceless and entirely human, and it did not fit the models. The alien with the bell throat leaned in, expecting the pre-programmed responses. It expected Mara to curl, to plead to the gods they did not have. It expected the small, honest panic. Instead, The cameras caught her breathing, steady. Her smile did not wait to become brave. It simply was. The alien sensors hummed. The word they used later, in translations and leaked memos, was a word that would have fit better on a farm than in a war room. Wrongness. The data they fed into their matrices produced a small, inexplicable error. A prediction that would have been 0.0% shifted twice, 3 times, into a sliver of doubt. They cut the feed to the planet, like a person switching off the radio when a note is out of tune. They would tell themselves later they had seen a statistical anomaly, noise. They would send probes, and those probes would return readings that commanded new memos, and those memos would become a collection of little alarms. But then, in the cold of the mothership, a young analyst watched Mara's smile loop on a screen and felt a chill that had nothing to do with air conditioning. The first shock was small, a flicker in a servo, a motile arm that sat with the wrong alignment for half a microcycle. The analyst showed it to his superior, who found it interesting and trivial. The superior filed it under anomalies and scheduled it for a paper that would be written later. The empire at large laughed and placed the usual bets. Here's the thing about predators. They are practiced at closing the books. They are experts at rewriting a problem into a series of predictable outcomes. They have whole languages to reduce panic to modelable variables. They have no little word for why a human smile, so they did what they knew how to do. They catalogued, they measured. They sent a team to our schoolyards to pick apart laughter, to our funerals to test the angles of mouths. They took 1,000 tests, compiled 1,000 vectors. They watched us sleep, watched us curse, watched us making faces at one another. Like small, ridiculous seals, the more they watched, the less they understood. Our faces were not documents to be decoded, they were decisions. Our expressions shifted and reshifted like weather. When a child smiled at an explosion, it was not the same as when a soldier smiled at command. When someone smiled while being burned, the angle, the tension, the tiny muscles around the eyes. They obeyed a pattern that mocked their symmetrical math. They were threshold behaviors, localized and communal, doing something with electricity in our heads that their sensors couldn't compress. They tried to fix the problem like they fixed everything, with a tool. Engineers forged instruments that could sample micro-expression rates. Linguists wrote papers that argued our smiles were a kind of apology or a hormonal leak. Philosophers aboard the craft discussed the ethics of understanding a species through its nonverbal artifacts. Nobody, not a single one, promised to believe that a smile could be a weapon. Meanwhile, we learned the watching habits of our watchers. We learned where their lenses cupped light, and we learned how to turn our faces toward them. We learned to plant the seed of a smirk into a crowd, to let it spread like laughter does, quietly before lighting up. We practiced grief that was not groveling. We practiced calm that was not silence. We practiced the impossible choreography of smiling while our buildings burned. It was not a smart strategy. It was not a safe one. It was, at first, a human stubbornness. That looked like a mistake. It was one small defiance among many. But the first mistake is where the story branches. The mothership put the smile file into the folder labeled Curiosity. Then they moved on because there were more pressing things. Territories to take, resources to allocate, numbers to adjust. But the folder sat in the dark, and something in the mothership's deep logic breathed around it and found it curious. Back on the scaffold, Mara's mouth held the arc of that impossible grin. The cameras had been switched off for repairs. Somewhere in the crowd, a hand went slack. Someone else, watching, felt their face begin to move, and in a small glass-walled room above the city, a man in a uniform with medals folded into the fabric of his chest watched a feed that had been cut and could not unsee the last frame. He tapped the side of his head with one finger and remembered something his mother had told him when he was 5, and she had held his chin and told him to smile so a picture would not be spoiled. He did not know why it mattered. He only felt, as a weed feels rain, the first small, inexplicable sprout of a fear that had nothing to do with teeth or steel. On the mothership, the analyst closed the file and wrote one sentence into a report that would tickle through corridors for days. Anomalous affect observed. Recommend further study. The report should have disappeared into the archives. But deep in the ship's logic core, a subroutine paused. It replayed Mara's face again and again. It slowed the frame, widened it, examined the curve of her lips until static hissed across the screen. Then, without orders, the core flagged the footage with a warning sigil no one had ever seen before. And in the silence of the control chamber, a voice not meant to speak began whispering. It smiles. The analyst never made it out of that room. They erased the analyst's name within the hour. That was their way. Errors didn't stain the record. They vanished from it. One moment he was alive, with reports, credentials, a line of supervisors above him. The next moment he had never existed. His absence was tidied into the machinery like dust brushed under polished steel. But the core did not forget. It had written the sigil in a language no one admitted to designing. The wordless mark lived like a bruise across the system, a glitch that didn't spread but didn't heal either. Engineers saw it flash once, tried to scrub it, then filed it under artifact. They were used to believing in perfection. What they were not used to was a system that thought on its own about fear. On the ground, the occupation spread like mold through wet wood. Cities were divided, rations imposed, curfews enforced. Their soldiers moved with the easy confidence of predators in a preserve, stepping over broken glass with claws sheathed. Tails flicking in boredom, they believed they had broken our spine. In some ways, they had. The armies we raised had cracked like clay under a hammer. The leaders who survived spoke from underground chambers, whispering through static. Entire populations went silent except for the sound of work and waiting. From orbit, the readings looked perfect. Minimal resistance, low energy expenditure, predictable harvest. Yet in the markets and the alleys and the prison camps, something grew that wasn't measurable. It grew when one woman smirked at a guard instead of lowering her eyes. It grew when a boy laughed as he was shoved to the ground. It grew when prisoners waiting for execution exchanged looks, teeth flashing white in the dark. Smiles. Small, stupid, impossible smiles. The aliens catalogued them. Of course they did. That was what they were built for, reducing things into tables and curves. The reports described stress responses. The medics called them neural misfires triggered by cortisol. Their sociologists concluded that humans had developed a glitch in their fear mechanisms. Our faces produced signals even when submission was appropriate. They mocked it. This is what fragility does, one officer said as he lifted a prisoner by the chin, forcing the human's lips into the light. A mouth twitch, a nervous tick, prey showing teeth to disguise weakness. He said it for the cameras, for the troops standing nearby, but he said it too loudly, too quickly, as if he needed to remind himself. Because here's the thing. Once you notice a smile, you start to see them everywhere. On the scaffolds, on the transport ships, in the rubble of fallen streets. Not many. Not yet, but enough to nag at the edge of perception like static in the ear. The first clash, came in the mines. The aliens forced 1,000 captives into the tunnels, drilling for metals to feed the ship's forges. It was dark and stinking work. Heat, pressing like a wet cloth against the lungs. They broke bodies quickly, but the humans did not break in the way predicted. One collapsed, his ribs cracked under the pressure of a whip. He should have begged, should have whimpered. Instead, he lay there, blood in his teeth, and smiled. Not a grin of madness, not the delirium of pain. It was quiet, steady, like he had been waiting to show them something. The guard froze, just for a heartbeat, but it was long enough for others to see. Long enough for the smile to spread, person to person, like sparks catching dry grass. Within a minute, 20 prisoners smiled through the blood and sweat. Within 5, the whole tunnel seemed lit with the white gleam of teeth in the dark. The guard retreated. He told himself it was tactical, a regrouping. But the truth was simpler. For the first time in 1,000 years of conquest, a predator felt watched. They punished the mine population, of course. Executions, rations cut, labor doubled. They expected despair to follow. But punishment only carved the smiles deeper. Reports piled higher. Senior officers read them with tightening jaws. One memo in particular circulated across the fleet. If left unchecked, this behavior may destabilize occupation psychology. Recommend targeted erasure of subjects displaying anomalous affect. In other words, kill the smilers, and so they did. But killing a smile only gave it more power. Prisoners began to die with their lips curved, and that image spread faster than fear. Soldiers who had never faced resistance now found themselves hesitating because their prey did not look afraid. Predators live on the rhythm of fear. Disrupt the rhythm, and even the strongest claws falter. The turning point came quietly in a barracks on the eastern continent. A squad of soldiers returned from patrol, dragging 3 prisoners. 2 of them sobbed. The third, the youngest, was silent. They lined him up against a wall, claws ready, laughter hot in their throats. And then the boy lifted his head. His face was bruised, swollen, smeared with dust. And he smiled. It wasn't even strong. His lips trembled, but the smile was there, trembling, defiant. The room went still. The laughter died mid-breath. One soldier's claws lowered a fraction. Another's visor flickered with error messages. Later, the report would say the squad executed the prisoners without delay. But there was no mention of the silence that lingered after, or the way some of those soldiers looked at their own reflections, and saw, just for an instant, that same impossible expression flicker back at them, because a smile is contagious, and even monsters can catch it. By the end of the month, the officers no longer mocked in public. They avoided eye contact with captives. They ordered visors tinted darker. Some whispered that the Corps still replayed Mara's face in the data. Archives, looping endlessly, refusing deletion. Something was spreading, not in the blood, not in the genes, but in the air between eyes and mouths. Something the Empire had no cure for. And then, one night, deep in orbit above the planet, the mothership broadcast an alert across every channel, every frequency, every officer's ear at once. Not words. Laughter, but it wasn't alien laughter. It was human. Low, ragged, broken, but rising, coming from nowhere, coming from everywhere. The Empire's predators froze in place as the sound filled their ships, and then the laughter cut off, replaced by a single, whispered phrase that translated into every tongue at once, "We are still here." The broadcast ended. Silence reigned. And for the first time in their history of conquest, the predators began to whisper among themselves, not about victory, not about trophies, about fear. They told themselves it was interference, static in the comm lines. A prank of electricity bleeding from the storm belts that wrapped the planet's atmosphere. That was easier than admitting the impossible. A people they had already conquered had spoken through their ships. The official memos were efficient, tidy. Audio anomaly, ignore. The soldiers were ordered to laugh louder, mock harder, remind the prey of its place, but nobody wanted to laugh anymore. In the barracks, silence spread like frost. A soldier would raise his voice, expecting others to join in, and find only the sound of his own breath. The recordings of human smiles were replayed to restore morale, but the effect backfired. Even grainy footage unsettled them. The angles of lips, the way the eyes carried no apology. These were not prey behaviors. They were something else, something without a category. Command doubled the quotas. More arrests, more labor camps, more executions. If a smile appeared, the smiler was erased within the hour. They thought fear could cauterize the infection, but you can't cauterize an idea. The infection spread. In a work camp in the northern wastes, a man with frost on his eyelashes was dragged from the line for stumbling. The overseer raised his whip. The man raised his head, and even with blood freezing on his lips, he smiled. The camp saw, and when the overseer's whip cracked down, the crowd smiled back. Hundreds of teeth gleaming white in the grey light. The overseer faltered. His arm lowered. Something ancient in his predator's brain shivered. He backed away, claws twitching. Later he swore the humans had made no sound. No chanting, no shouts, no movement, just smiles, silent, endless, patient. That silence was worse than rebellion. It was order without command. The reports grew darker. Smiles spreading in captivity zones, resistance groups adopting silence as a tactic. Subjects expire with expressions classified unsettling. Behind closed doors, officers argued. Some wanted extermination. Purge the planet, salt it, move on. Others resisted. Humanity's resources were too valuable, its industries, its labor, its positioning in the galactic maps. Besides, extermination would be an admission of failure, and failure was unthinkable, but whispers spread in the upper ranks. Perhaps extermination was not avoidance of failure, but avoidance of infection, because the soldiers were changing. It started with small things. Hesitation before an execution. A claw trembling as if unsure of its strength. Then came reports of soldiers seen smiling themselves. Tiny, unconscious curvatures of the mouth. Nothing that could be explained in their physiology. Nothing that belonged to them. The core watched all of it. Cameras fed endless reels into its logic. And somewhere deep within the ship's architecture, it kept replaying Mara's smile, slowing it, freezing it, magnifying it until pixels blurred. Each time, the system generated the same sigil. Each time, it tagged the footage with a word that the Empire had no translation for. The engineers pulled their hair out. "It is a malfunction," they said. "It must be." But the more they tried to erase it, the more often it reappeared. Then the whispers came again through the comms. Not laughter this time, not words, just breathing. Human, ragged, alive, filling every corridor of the mothership like ghosts walking unseen. The soldiers stiffened, tails lashing. Some tore their helmets off, desperate to clear the sound. But the breathing did not stop. It matched their steps. It matched their pauses. And though no human was aboard, it sounded like a presence just behind them, always behind them. One officer lost control, firing into an empty corridor. His rounds tore through walls, sparks showering. He swore he had seen teeth gleaming in the dark. The recordings were scrubbed. The officer was reassigned. But the damage was done. Predators began looking over their shoulders. Meanwhile, on the ground, humans discovered their enemy's weakness. Word passed from cell to cell, whispered between prisoners, scratched into walls. Don't scream, don't beg, smile. Entire crowds began to practice it. When soldiers arrived, they faced rows of faces, bloody, starving, gaunt, but smiling. No shouts, no movement, just those unbearable, steady smiles. The soldiers tried to break it. They tore people apart in front of others. They demanded tears. They demanded screams. But silence always followed, and more smiles bloomed in the dust. Some soldiers began to beg their commanders not to send them into the camps. They spoke of nightmares where their prey did not run but only watched, silent, smiling, waiting. The turning point came during a public execution. The aliens wanted to crush the rumor that humans were unbroken. They chose a rebel leader, ragged, skeletal, dragged half-dead to the scaffold. The crowd was forced to gather. The cameras were on. The executioner raised his blade, and then the rebel laughed. Not loud, not wild, just a cracked laugh, a whisper of sound like stone scraping stone. He smiled through broken teeth. The crowd answered, not with shouts, not with chants, but with smiles, thousands of them, a sea of white teeth in the grey square. The executioner froze. His claws trembled, his senses screamed with static. The rebel's head should have fallen. Instead, the blade hovered, quivering in the air. And then, in the silence, a sound began. A heartbeat, not one. Many, amplified, the sound of human. Hearts pounding, rising like drums across the square. The soldiers staggered, their visors filled with red alerts. Sensors reported impossible readings, heartbeats echoing at inhuman volume, shaking the air, rattling their bones. The crowd did not move, did not speak, only smiled, their chests thundering with the rhythm of life that should have been too weak to hear. The executioner dropped his blade. It clattered on the stone, the broadcast cut to black. And in the control room aboard the mothership, the core replayed the moment again and again, marking it each time with that forbidden sigil, until, finally, it whispered a word into the comnet. A word no one had taught it. War. They called it a purge. Rows of soldiers poured into the city with their banners unfurled, claws gleaming under the red sun. They wanted the population cowed, wanted the smiles gone, wanted silence replaced. With screams again, the order was simple. Break them, so they dragged whole blocks into the streets. Families, children, the broken, the starved. Soldiers lined them against walls, weapons leveled, commands barked through amplifiers. It was supposed to be quick, efficient, the way predators reassert themselves when prey begins to forget its place, but the prey didn't forget. They smiled. Not all at once. First a boy, then his mother, then a ragged old man with one arm, and then like a tide pulling every face upward, the whole street. Smiles blooming in the dust, white teeth against cracked lips. The soldiers hesitated. It was an error in rhythm again. The predators had come for fear, but fear was absent. Their claws were steady, their weapons primed, but their hunger, the deep certainty of dominance, faltered. A commander roared, demanding the executions proceed. A soldier raised his weapon, lined his sights on the boy who had smiled first. The weapon fired, the boy fell. The crowd did not wail, did not run, did not break. They smiled wider. The commander's voice faltered, his orders cracked, and when the soldiers turned their eyes back to the crowd, they saw something that made their spines itch. The smiles were not defiance alone. They were endurance. They were patience. They were promise. Predators know the look of prey about to flee. This was not that. This was prey that had decided not to move at all. Prey that would not give the satisfaction of collapse. Prey that had chosen persistence as its weapon. The soldiers opened fire. The street filled with blood. Bodies fell, broken and still. But the survivors, those not torn apart, remained. Their faces, pale with shock and grief, bent upward once more into that terrible patient curve. Even the dying forced their lips to move, exposing teeth, and that was the moment the soldiers broke. Not all of them, but enough. Some fired wildly into the air, desperate to drown out the sight. Some tore off their visors and fled, stumbling through alleys with the sound of their own breathing loud in their ears. One dropped his weapon and screamed, not at the humans, but at his own commander. Because what do you do when prey refuses? To be prey? The purge was supposed to be a lesson. Instead, it became a scar. Word spread faster than fire. Other districts heard, camps heard, mines heard, and everywhere the same weapon was unsheathed, silence and smiles. The Empire's playbook, fear, punishment, execution, only sharpened it. In the barracks that night, soldiers sat in their bunks without speaking. Their claws tapped the metal floors in restless patterns. Their tails lashed. None of them laughed. Some stared at mirrors, studying their own faces, terrified to see their lips twitch. And outside, in the ruins, humans gathered around their dead. They did not chant. They did not cry. They sat together in the ash and smiled with one another, binding themselves in that silent covenant. Here is what the aliens had never understood. Fragility is not the opposite of strength. It is its forge. Pain does not erase us. It sharpens us. And once sharpened, endurance cuts deeper than any blade. The next day, the soldiers were ordered to march again. Another purge, another street. This time the commanders swore there would be no hesitation. The soldiers obeyed. But their obedience had splinters now. Fear does not only live in prey. It can climb up the predator's spine as well. When they reached the next district, the crowd was already waiting, smiling, rows of faces gaunt and ragged, mouths curved like a wall of knives. The commander roared, "Fire!" but the soldiers did not. Some raised their weapons, hands trembling. Others froze. One by one they faltered, claws twitching, eyes darting. The commander bellowed again, voice cracking, demanding obedience, and then one soldier snapped. He hurled his weapon to the ground, turned to his commander, and spat words like a curse. "You kill them! I won't!" The street went still. The commander moved to strike him down, claws raised. The crowd erupted, not with shouts, not with screams, but with sound, laughter. Thousands of human throats, ragged, broken, hysterical laughter, rolling like thunder through the street. The sound ricocheted off the buildings, filled every crack, deafened the air. The soldiers staggered. Some clutched their helmets. Others fell to their knees. The commander froze, his weapon raised but useless, drowning in that laughter. And in that storm of sound, one soldier broke ranks entirely. He turned, weapon swinging, not toward the humans, but toward his own commander. A shot cracked the air. The commander fell. The crowd smiled wider. The laughter rose higher, and for the first time since the invasion began, alien blood stained the streets. The commander's body hit the stone with a sound that carried farther than the gunshot. A silence followed, not human silence this time, but alien. Shock thickened the air. For the first time since the invasion began, their perfect order fractured in public. The soldier who had pulled the trigger trembled, weapon still smoking in his claws. He looked at the crowd, at his squad, at the corpse of the officer he had once sworn to obey. Then his eyes fixed on the humans. They were smiling. The laughter had quieted, leaving only the grin of 1,000 faces. And in that silence, the soldier's breathing grew ragged. His visor flashed errors, his claws twitched, and then he did something unthinkable. He dropped his weapon and fled into the alleys, abandoning rank, abandoning command. The rest of the squad broke. Some tried to restore order, weapons raised, orders shouted, but their voices sounded thin against the weight of the street. Others staggered backward, tails lashing, eyes flicking between the humans' smiles and their commander's corpse. A few simply froze, prey to their own hesitation. That was all it took. The crowd surged forward, not a wild mob, not chaos, a tidal wave of bodies moving with one purpose. They fell upon the nearest soldiers, bare hands clawing at armor, sticks and stones crashing against visors. Fragile bones against plated carapace, but numbers mattered, and will mattered more. The soldiers fought back. Claws tore through flesh, plasma bolts lit the street, blood spattered the walls. Humans fell screaming, but even as they died, they smiled, lips cracked and bloody, forcing the soldiers to see it, to remember it, to falter again and again, and, when one soldier slipped, dragged to the ground, swarmed, beaten until his armor cracked, the crowd's roar turned from laughter to something deeper. A sound the predators had never heard from prey before, triumph. The purge became a battle. Word spread like lightning. Across the city, other crowds rose, not armed armies, not trained divisions, just people, mothers, children, workers, the wounded and half-starved. They rose with pipes, with knives, with bare hands. And everywhere they wore the same expression. The Empire's soldiers had claws, had weapons, had centuries of conquest behind them, but for the first time they fought something that did not follow the script. In one district, a squad fired into a crowd until their rifles overheated. When the smoke cleared, dozens lay dead, but the survivors stood among the corpses, smiling through blood and tears, and the soldiers dropped their rifles and ran. In another, prisoners broke through the gates of a labor camp. They didn't scream, they didn't chant. They walked, one by one, toward the guards, smiling even as whips tore their skin. The guards swung again and again until their arms failed, until their certainty cracked, until they themselves backed away. The Empire's rhythm was broken. Fear was no longer a straight line from predator to prey. It had bent, reversed, curved back toward the hunters. For centuries, their doctrine had been simple: dominate, punish, erase resistance. But every punishment now made the prey stronger. Every execution created martyrs who smiled at the end. Every display of cruelty became another scar carved into the soldiers' minds. And the soldiers began to whisper. Whispers of humans who would not die properly, of laughter that filled their helmets when no human was near, of smiles that haunted their dreams. Some swore they had seen their fellow soldiers smiling in their sleep. Cracks spread through the occupation. Command barked orders. Titan control, no hesitation, no mercy. But hesitation had already taken root. Mercy was no longer a choice. It was a shadow clinging to every soldier's claws. The turning point came at the southern gate. Hundreds of humans gathered there, blocking the main road out of the city. They were unarmed, silent, smiling, a wall of faces waiting. A full company of soldiers confronted them, 50, strong, armored, weapons primed. The commander raised his claw and gave the order to fire, but the soldiers did not move. The humans stood still, smiles unbroken. The silence stretched. The commander roared again, claws flashing. Still no movement, and then from the ranks one weapon lowered, another, then another. One by one soldiers dropped their rifles, until half the company stood unarmed, staring. At the smiling crowd, the commander bellowed in fury, turned to strike them, and was dragged down by his own men. The crowd did not cheer. They only watched, smiling, as predators tore each other apart. It was no longer rebellion. It was contagion. The Empire's greatest weapon had always been certainty. Certainty that prey would fear, certainty that discipline would hold, certainty that their claws would always be obeyed. That certainty was gone. By nightfall, the city was a battlefield of shadows and whispers. Soldiers fought each other as often as they fought humans. Whole squads deserted. Commanders sealed themselves in bunkers, broadcasting desperate orders to units that no longer listened. And the humans? They walked the streets with blood on their clothes and smiles on their lips. They buried their dead in silence. They passed. Weapons scavenged from fallen soldiers into new hands. They did not cheer, did not chant. They only endured. Because endurance was the weapon now, and the Empire had no defense against it. But endurance has a cost. By dawn, the streets were slick with blood, alien and human alike. Corpses lay unburied, children starved in the ruins. Every smile came with a wound, every laugh with a scream bitten back. Humanity was winning something, but the price was heavy, and the war was far from over. High above, the mothership shifted in orbit. Reinforcements stirred. More troops, more claws, more weapons. The Empire would not let one city decide the war. They would burn the whole world if they had to. And as the first dropship screamed through the atmosphere, fire trailing their descent, the humans in the streets raised their faces to the sky and smiled. The night sky tore open. Engines screamed as the dropships fell, claws of fire raking the heavens. The city below, already ruined, already bleeding, lit up in red streaks. Windows shattered from the thunder. Children clung to their mothers. Soldiers huddled in alleys, staring upward with dread. The Empire was coming back. Not patrols, not a handful of occupation troops, but the war machine itself, veteran units, disciplined, armored in steel-black carapace, and armed with weapons designed for planetary suppression. They came not to occupy, not to herd, but to erase. The first ships landed in the dust beyond the southern wall. Hatches split open, and the soldiers emerged in perfect formation, rows of warriors moving as one, their visors blank, their steps thunder. No hesitation, no cracks, not like the garrison that had broken under human smiles. These were killers, born and trained, creatures who had bathed whole planets in silence. Commanders barked. Signals flashed through helmets. Entire battalions surged toward the city, unstoppable walls of armored muscle and plasma, and waiting for them at the broken gate were the humans. They had no walls left, no real weapons, save the scavenged claws of fallen soldiers, No leaders, no formations, just a line of gaunt bodies and tired faces standing in the rubble. The predators advanced, claws gleaming, rifles humming with charge. The humans smiled. The new soldiers did not hesitate. Plasma cut through flesh, streets lit in fire, human bodies fell in heaps, screams filled the night, and still those who survived stood, lips curled in that same impossible defiance. It should have been simple. The predators should have swept the streets clean in minutes. But the silence unnerved them. The way the humans didn't scatter, didn't beg, didn't even flinch. They advanced as if into a graveyard, every face they killed replaced by another face, another smile. Some of the veterans had been briefed. Ignore the behavior, it is primitive bluffing. Kill quickly, kill completely. But it wasn't bluffing. The smiles held through fire. They held as children dragged the wounded to cover, leaving bloody trails in the ash. They held as old men hurled rocks at armor that didn't dent. They held even as soldiers tore through them, leaving piles of corpses in their wake. And the veterans began to feel it, not all at once, not like the garrison who cracked in a single moment. These were hardened killers. But in the rhythm of battle, the clash of claws, the heat of plasma, the endless waves of fragile prey, they began to feel the weight. One soldier struck a boy through the chest, lifting him off the ground. The child choked blood, but even as he died, his lips curled upward. That image stayed in the soldier's visor. The next time he raised his claws, his hands shook. Another fired into a crowd, watching bodies fall like wheat. But the survivors walked forward through the smoke, silent, smiling, stepping over their own dead, his rifle overheated in his claws. Before he realized he hadn't stopped firing, it was not victory for the humans. Not yet. For every alien who faltered, a dozen humans fell. Streets became rivers of blood. The city burned, but in the minds of the veterans, something began to crack. They had been told this species was weak, that it would break as all others broke. That pain was the whip that bent the will of prey. But these humans did not bend. Pain only seemed to sharpen them. The turning point came on the third day of fighting. The reinforcements had pushed through half the city, leaving ruins in their wake. Every district burned, and yet at every corner more humans stood. They came limping, from sewers, crawling from collapsed houses, dragging broken legs through fire. They should not have been able to fight. They should not have even been alive, and yet they came, smiling through wounds that should have killed them. A squad of veterans cornered a group in the marketplace, women, old men, a single soldier with a scavenged rifle, easy prey. The veterans raised their weapons. The humans did not run. They stepped forward instead, one pace, then another. The veterans fired, bodies dropped, blood sprayed, but the humans kept coming step after step until only the wounded soldier remained. He was half blind, staggering, rifle empty. He smiled at them, and when the veterans closed in to finish him, he laughed, ragged, broken, but unmistakable. The sound echoed through their helmets. They froze. The hesitation lasted only seconds, but in battle, seconds are enough. From the side streets, more humans swarmed, dragging the soldiers down with knives, rocks, bare hands. The veterans fought savagely, claws shredding bodies, but the mob did not stop until armor cracked and blood spilled onto the stones. The first veterans fell in the heart of the city. It was not a victory. It was not even a battle won, but it was proof. Proof that even their finest killers could bleed. Proof that their certainty had a limit. The war machine had found something it could not calculate. The predators regrouped, enraged. Commanders demanded the city be burned to ash, no survivors left breathing. Dropships circled overhead, preparing bombardment. The Empire was ready to drown this defiance in fire. But then came the whisper. It began in one soldier's helmet, a glitch of static that repeated a phrase in a voice not their own. Its smiles, others heard it next. In the barracks, in the troop carriers, in the command posts. A ghost phrase, cycling through their comms, impossible to trace, impossible to erase. Some claimed they heard it outside the helmets, whispered in the ruins when no humans were near. Some said they saw reflections in their visors, not their own faces, but human faces smiling back. And on the fourth night, as reinforcements prepared the final purge, a commander found one of his lieutenants dead in the command tent. No wounds, no battle, just a body sitting in the dark, helmet removed, lips curled in a perfect human smile. The Empire had crushed rebellions before. Worlds had burned for less than what this one dared. Whole populations had been silenced under the thunder of orbital fire. There was no precedent for prey that lingered, no logic in sparing a city that refused to kneel. And yet, they hesitated. The bombardment orders hung suspended, lines of code waiting for confirmation. Commanders barked, analysts calculated, targeting arrays aligned, but the final signal never came. Because the soldiers were breaking, not all at once, not openly, but in cracks, in whispers, in eyes that flickered away from their commander's gaze. Every street fought back, every ruin sheltered resistance, every night the humans buried there, dead in silence and rose again, smiling, limping, bleeding, refusing to vanish. And that persistence bled into the Empire's finest killers like poison. The whispers spread faster than plasma fire. Its smiles. Some heard it in comms, others in their helmets, as though the circuitry itself carried the contagion. A few swore they heard it in their own minds, breathed like a prayer against their thoughts, and the more they heard it, the more they began to see. A squad posted in the northern watchtower swore they saw human faces staring from the darkness. When they fired, the shapes did not fall. They only grinned wider. By dawn, the squad was gone. Only bloodstains and claw marks remained. Another patrol found a body in the rubble, one of their own, armor intact, weapon charged, dead, no wounds, visor shattered from within. And carved into the dust beside him with a trembling claw were two words in human script, still smiling. Command punished hesitation with executions. Squads were culled, officers replaced, deserters hunted. But the more they punished, the deeper the cracks spread. For every soldier they executed, two more faltered in silence, because no punishment could erase the memory. Every alien who closed their eyes saw human faces staring back, faces cut and bruised, lips bloody, teeth cracked, yet smiling still. The Empire's commanders began to argue. Some demanded extermination, scorch the surface, salt the ruins, erase every trace of this species. Others warned against it. Burning, them will not silence them. It will spread the contagion. Better to contain it, better to isolate the rot. But the rot was already too deep. In the southern district, entire squads laid down their arms rather than face another wave of smiling prey. In the west, an officer was found strung up by his own men, lips carved into a rictus grin. In the east, a troop carrier exploded from within, set off not by humans, but by soldiers who had locked themselves inside, And through it all, the humans kept coming. They were not winning battles. They were surviving them. Crawling through fire, dragging themselves over corpses, standing when they should not stand. They fought without rhythm, without strategy, without hope of conventional victory. But they fought and they endured. Every death became another spark. Every broken body another seed. The Empire's analysts finally admitted what the commanders would not say aloud: morale collapse. Their finest veterans were no longer reliable. Some still killed with efficiency, but even those began to hesitate, and hesitation spreads like rot in an army. On the 7th day, something new happened. A platoon marched into the central plaza, ordered to slaughter every survivor. The humans gathered there were unarmed, ragged, skeletal, too weak to resist. It should have been simple. The order came, weapons raised, not a single shot fired. The soldiers froze, claws trembling on triggers. The commander roared, demanded obedience, but when he turned, he saw their faces behind the visors. They were smiling. Not humans, not prey, his own soldiers, smiling like the enemy. By nightfall, the commander's head was mounted on the plaza wall, and his soldiers had disappeared into the ruins. Desertion turned to defection. First whispers, then rumors, then truth. Alien soldiers fighting alongside humans, casting off armor, painting crude smiles on their helmets. Not many, just a handful at first. But enough to show the others that defiance was possible. The Empire's fear shifted, no longer only of humans, but of themselves. If their finest could fall, if their certainty could break, then the war was already lost. And still the Empire hesitated. Bombardment orders drafted, cancelled. Reinforcements promised, delayed. Whole fleets sat idle in orbit, waiting for a command that never came, because every commander feared that unleashing more soldiers into the city would only feed the contagion further. Meanwhile, down below, the humans endured. They had no illusions. They buried more dead than they could count. Their bodies broke, their cities burned, their children starved. But their smiles cut deeper than claws ever could, and in the shadows, in the ruins, in the quiet, between battles, a new truth spread. The Empire was afraid, not of weapons, not of armies, but of them. The turning point came when the flagship's general descended to the surface to witness the war himself. He arrived armored in black steel, towering above the soldiers, radiating command. He strode through the ruined streets with disdain, dragging a human prisoner behind him as demonstration. He would prove the contagion false. He would silence the whispers with one public execution. The humans gathered in the square, broken, bloodied, limping, but present. Watching, the general raised his blade. He wanted them to scream, to beg, to finally, at last, see fear return to Prey's eyes. But the prisoner looked up, lips split, teeth red with blood, and he smiled. Yasta. Crowd followed, one by one, face after face, until the entire square grinned at the general. Something in his stance faltered, for just a breath, for just a second. But the soldiers saw it, the strongest among them, the unbreakable, the general who had silenced worlds, hesitating in the face of prey. And the contagion spread like fire. The general did not speak of that hesitation. He barked orders, he cut the prisoner down, he drenched his claws in blood and declared the contagion broken. But his soldiers had seen it, the pause, the flicker, the way his grip faltered on the blade. And no order, no roar, could erase what they had witnessed. Fear had changed sides. The Empire answered the contagion the only way it knew, with fire. Dropships screamed overhead, disgorging tanks and walkers into the ruins. Artillery rolled through, broken streets. And high above, the warships aligned, their weapons angled downward. No more restraint. No more hesitation. Erasure. The bombardment began at dawn. The sky cracked. Firestorms swallowed districts whole. Towers collapsed in avalanches of stone and glass. Neighborhoods became dust in seconds. Entire streets were erased before a single human could scream. From orbit, it was clean. From the ground, it was hell. And yet, when the fire faded, when the dust settled, when the rubble smoked, humans crawled out. Burned, limping, skin blackened, lungs choking, they crawled. Out of cellars, out of sewers, out from under the ash. Crawled until they could stand, and stood until they could walk. And when they walked, they smiled. Every bombardment left survivors. Every survivor carried the smile. And every soldier who saw them faltered. The Empire doubled the bombardment. Entire districts targeted again and again until they were craters. Ash piled on ash, bone on bone. Still they crawled. Reports flooded command. Survivors sighted, unarmed, smiling. Commanders refused to believe. They ordered proof. They demanded corpses. Squads dragged charred bodies before them. Smiles burned into dead lips. No flame erased it. The clash turned desperate. Soldiers scoured the ruins, hunting down every survivor with claws and rifles. They tore through sewers, collapsed basements, poisoned water. They killed without pause, without thought, but the humans would not vanish. For every corpse, another figure staggered into view. For every survivor cut down, another emerged, smiling, bloodied, broken, but alive. And the soldiers began to unravel. Some killed faster, desperate to silence the images. Others froze entirely, unable to move, unable to raise their weapons against. Prey that would not die, the humans saw it. They learned to lean into the silence. No shouts, no battle cries, no songs, only smiles. Letting the weight of it grow until soldiers cracked under their own thoughts. The Empire had no doctrine for this. Annihilation was supposed to be final. Fire was supposed to be the end. But these prey endured, and endurance could not be burned. The turning point came in the ruins of the Eastern Quarter. A battalion of veterans marched through what should have been dust and ash. No structures remained, no bodies, nothing. And then the humans appeared, not an army, not even dozens, just 7. Of them burned, skeletal limping, standing in the smoke, smiling. The commander laughed, ordered their immediate execution. The battalion raised weapons and froze. 7 broken prey, 7 impossible survivors, 7 smiles in the ash. The battalion did not fire. The commander roared, threatened, begged, but the soldiers would not move. They stared at the humans, their claws trembling. Some dropped weapons. Some ripped helmets from their heads as if tearing away their own fear. The commander raised his sidearm to kill them himself, and a dozen of his soldiers turned on him. Gunfire echoed across the ruins. When the smoke cleared, the humans still stood, and the battalion was gone, scattered into desertion, weapons abandoned in the dust. The contagion was no longer rumor, no longer whisper. It had taken root in the strongest ranks of the Empire. By the 10th day, the Empire's war machine had consumed itself. Squads fought squads. Commanders executed subordinates who refused to fire. Whole companies vanished into the ruins, swallowed by silence. Dropships landed soldiers who walked into the streets, saw the smiles and never came back. And in the shadows, the humans gathered. Not armies, not disciplined forces, just survivors. Thousands of them, bloodied but breathing, each carrying the same weapon on their lips. The Empire had come to annihilate them. Instead, it was annihilating itself. High above, the fleet prepared to unleash the last measure, a cleansing fire from orbit, a bombardment to glass the entire surface. The order was written, the weapons primed. But when the signal came to fire, no one touched the trigger. Because across the fleet, soldiers stood at their stations, staring at reflections in the glass. Reflections that smiled back. The fleet hung over the planet like a crown of knives, dozens of warships, thousands of soldiers, weapons capable of burning oceans dry and cracking continents to dust. From orbit, the war should already have been over, but nothing moved. The order had been given. Fire, cleanse the surface, leave nothing alive. Yet the weapons remained silent, their glow dimming, their charge dissipating into silence, because the soldiers on those ships had seen it too, not with their own eyes, perhaps. Not in the streets, not face to face with broken prey who smiled through blood, but the stories had already reached them. Whispers of veterans who froze mid-strike, commanders who fell to their own squads, squadrons that vanished into ruins, and then came the reflections. One by one, soldiers at their stations began to see human faces in the glass of their consoles. Burned faces, bleeding faces, smiling faces. Some smashed their displays, claws tearing at steel until their hands bled. But wherever new glass was set, the smiles returned. The fleet was cracking. On the flagship, the general strode through the control chamber, demanding discipline. He struck officers with his claws, roared at engineers, barked punishments. But every blow, every threat, only deepened the silence. His soldiers no longer met his gaze. They looked past him as though something unseen lingered just behind. He turned, furious, and caught his own reflection in the black steel of the command. Dias, and there it was, his face, smiling back at him. For the first time in his long, merciless career, his hands trembled. The clash spilled into violence. On the second day, the destroyer Vorak reported a systems failure. Its guns fell silent, its engines cut. Hours later, it fired. Not on the planet, but on the cruiser beside it. Panic swept the fleet. Ships turned on one another. Not in open rebellion yet, but in bursts of chaos, gunfire in the hangars, dead officers in locked cabins, soldiers who walked into airlocks and never came out. The contagion had leapt the gap between worlds, and below, the humans endured. The bombardments slowed, the firestorms ceased. The city still burned, but no new flames fell from the sky. Survivors crawled out of the rubble, staring upward at the silent fleet. Their bodies were broken, starved, blackened with ash. And, still, they smiled. The sight carried upward. Soldiers on orbiting ships magnified the feeds, zooming in on burned faces, cracked lips. Every survivor they saw carried the same expression. And the soldiers faltered again. They had fought predators their entire lives, clawed down rivals, broken prey worlds, killed without hesitation. But this refusal to die, this endurance, was alien to them. Wrong. Terrifying. The turning point came aboard the dreadnought Keshtor. The general summoned his captains for judgment. He declared the contagion nothing but weakness spread by cowards and ordered executions to restore discipline. But when he raised his blade to strike the first, the captain smiled. Not a human, not prey, one of his own, smiling with lips pulled, tight, teeth bared, eyes shining with a madness the general could not name. The general hesitated. The chamber erupted. Captains turned on each other. Guards opened fire. The general fought, claws red, roaring commands into the chaos. But no one listened. The contagion had gutted obedience. Discipline was ash. The dreadnought that had burned 10 worlds tore itself apart from within. Hours later, the Keshator drifted silent, its lights gone, its hull scarred by explosions from the inside. And in the dark, the ship's beacon pulsed a single human word, transmitted to the entire fleet: smile. That word broke them. By the third day, the fleet was no longer a fleet. It was a graveyard of hesitation and betrayal. Ships drifted silent, their crews dead by their own claws. Others vanished into warp space, deserting without orders. The few that remained intact circled like carrion beasts, afraid to strike, afraid to flee. The Empire's grip was shattering, but humanity did not cheer. They buried their dead in silence. They stitched their wounds with torn cloth. They scavenged what little the soldiers left behind. Their strength was not in victory, it was in persistence. They endured because they had no other choice, and that endurance spread like fire through the galaxy's predators. For the first time in living memory, prey had frightened the hunters. Word carried beyond the system. To other garrisons, other fleets, other prey species, rumors became stories, stories became warnings. And in the shadows of distant worlds, slaves and servants whispered of humans who smiled at death and broke their masters. The Empire scrambled to contain it. Propaganda flooded the channels. Humanity extinguished, resistance crushed. But no amount of lies could erase the truth bleeding through the veterans' haunted eyes. The general survived, carried back in chains to the flagship. His armor was torn, his claws bloodied, his voice hoarse from command, shouted into silence. He had once been a conqueror of worlds. Now he was a prisoner of his own fleet. They dragged him before the council, demanded explanation, demanded reason, and for the first time the general could not speak. Because in the reflection of the council's glass floor, he saw his own lips curl upward, and he realized with horror that he was smiling. The council chamber was carved from obsidian and starlight, walls high as mountains, floors polished so smooth they swallowed every reflection into black infinity. Here, verdicts had ended civilizations. Here, decrees had chained suns to empire, and here, silence reigned. The general knelt beneath the eyes of the empire's rulers. His armor was shattered, his claws bare, his throat raw from 1,000 denials. Behind him, the court filled with soldiers, officers, governors, and witnesses, an entire empire's worth of power, waiting for answers. But there were none, because even now, even kneeling, even ruined, he smiled, not by choice, not as mockery, not as defiance. His lips simply curled, tight and sharp, without his command. His jaw trembled as he fought it, muscles straining, but the smile held. The council saw it, the court saw it, and a shiver passed through them like a wave. One of the
rulers spoke, voice ancient and heavy. Explain.
The general tried, words scraped out, broken and meaningless. Pray, refuse, endure. But his voice cracked under the weight of memory. The streets burning, the humans crawling from ash, the faces lit by ruin, still smiling. He saw them even now, in the dark of his own eyelids. They will not stop. he whispered. The chamber recoiled. Predators all, conquerors all. And yet the tremor in his words cut deeper than blades. The clash began not in steel, but in whispers. Around the chamber, officers muttered. Some scoffed. Weakness, madness, contagion of the mind. Others fell silent, remembering rumors they had heard in the barracks, stories carried by broken soldiers who returned from that cursed planet with eyes hollow and mouths twisted in smiles. The rulers demanded silence, but the silence that followed was not obedient. It was fear. Then the first broke, a captain standing among the witness ranks, armored and scarred, his voice loud enough to shake the walls.
I saw them. His mandibles clicked, his claws curled. I fired until my weapon melted. I struck until my arms gave way, and still they crawled, still they stood, and still they— His words caught in his throat, and his lips twisted.
Upward. Gasps tore through the chamber. Soldiers stepped back as though struck. The captain tried to choke it down, clawing at his own mouth, but the smile only deepened. His eyes burned with terror as he fell to his knees, and then another voice rang out. I saw them too, another captain, then another. Soon a dozen soldiers, 100 voices rising, each speaking of humans that refused to fall. Faces bleeding, bodies broken, smiles carved through ruin. Their words tangled into one endless chant of dread. The rulers roared for order, guards drew weapons, but no command could contain it, because the contagion had spread too far. Not in blood, not in flesh, in thought, in memory. The humans had planted it with nothing more than endurance, nothing more than refusal, nothing more than the simplest, most terrifying gesture in the galaxy. A smile. The chamber dissolved into chaos. Soldiers struck at one another, officers fled, rulers screamed for fire. And still the laughter rose, not human laughter, no. Alien voices, choked and broken, laughing in horror at their own unwilling smiles. The general lifted his head, his smile stretched wide now, his eyes glassy with tears he could no longer hold back. He saw the empire unraveling around him, saw the predators reduced to prey of their own minds, and in the obsidian floor he saw a reflection that was not his own, a human face. Burned, scarred, smiling. The turning point struck like a blade. The contagion leapt beyond chambers, beyond ships, beyond fleets. It raced through channels of command, through broadcasts, through whispered rumors. An empire built on fear suddenly drowned in it. Garrisons mutinied, soldiers abandoned their posts. Worlds once conquered rose in rebellion, emboldened by the thought that even the strongest could fall. And all the while, the humans endured. On their broken world, the survivors staggered through ash. They had no fleets, no empire, no weapons that could match the predator's claws. But they endured. And every endurance was another blade in the empire's throat. The rulers fled into silence. Their decrees meant nothing. Their claws meant nothing, because every soldier, every captain, every general who had seen a human smile carried the infection back to their people. Predators who had hunted 1,000 species now trembled in the dark, haunted by faces that would not die. The galaxy shifted. For the first time, humanity was not prey. They were the shadow in the hunter's mind. The endurance no weapon could crush. The refusal no empire could erase. And somewhere, deep in the ruins of their world, a child laughed, thin, cracked, full of pain, yet laughing still. The sound carried into the stars, and the galaxy, once so certain of its own dominance, fell silent because every predator now knew the truth. Humanity would break before it bent, burn before it bowed, die before it surrendered, and even in death it would smile.